Stand close to the Colosseum, close enough to lay your hand on the stone, and you will see that the building is sick. The great outer wall, the pale honey-colored stone that has stood over Rome for 19 centuries, is covered in holes, thousands upon thousands of them, deep, squarish pits, gouged into the blocks in rough vertical lines as though the whole structure had been raked by some enormous claw. They run across every face of the surviving building, so many that from a distance the wall seems pocked and scarred, like skin marked by a terrible disease. Almost everyone who visits assumes this is simply age, weather, the slow bite of 1900 years of Roman rain and wind. It is not. Every one of those holes was made by human hands, and made deliberately, and made for the same reason, because there was metal inside. Buried in the joints of the Colosseum, pinning its blocks together, was a hidden skeleton of iron, hundreds of tons of it. And in the hungry centuries after Rome fell, men came with picks and crowbars and dug it all out block by block to melt down and sell. They tore the iron nerves out of the standing building. The holes are simply where the metal used to be. So the first thing to understand about the most famous ruin on Earth is that it is a ruin partly because it was mined, cannibalized over centuries, for the very materials it was built from. We come to photograph the Colosseum as a symbol of Roman death. We rarely notice that the building itself was slowly killed for its stone and its iron. This is the history of the Colosseum, not the emperors, not the gladiators, at least not yet. The one thing almost nobody asks about a building we have all seen 1,000 times, what it is actually made of. Start with the size, because the size is the thing that silences you. The Colosseum is an ellipse, a great flattened ring of stone, 189 meters long and 156 wide, its outer wall rising nearly 50 meters, as high as a modern building of 15 stories. It could seat something like 50,000 people and empty them all through 80 arched doorways in minutes. For 1,000 years it was the largest amphitheater in the world, and it has never been beaten. There is no bigger one anywhere, and there never has been. But what is it made of? Not one material, 4. And the Colosseum is best understood not as a monument, but as a machine for killing, watched by a city. And like any machine, it was assembled from different parts, each chosen for a different job. There is the skeleton, travertine, a hard pale limestone cut in colossal blocks and stacked into the piers and arches that carry the whole enormous weight. Around 100,000 cubic meters of it quarried out of the hills to the east. There is the flesh, Roman concrete, volcanic rock, and brick, poured and packed into the vaults and the foundations, the cheap, gray mass that fills the spaces between the bones. There is the nervous system, iron, perhaps 300 tons of it, forged into clamps and pins and run through the stone to lock the blocks together and stop the arena from tearing itself apart. And there is the muscle, timber and rope and bronze, the hidden engine of lifts and trapdoors and winches buried beneath the floor that made men and beasts rise up into the light as if conjured out of nothing. Skeleton, flesh, nerves, and muscle. That is the Colosseum. 4 materials, 4 stories, 1 machine, and every one of them came out of the ground and had to be dragged and shaped and set in place by hand. Begin with the bones. 20 miles east of Rome, where the plain crumples up into hills, there is a town the Romans called Tibur, Tivoli today, and around it the ground is made of a strange, pale, cream and honey-colored stone. They named it lapis tiburtinus, the stone of Tibur. We have worn that name down over the centuries into a single word, travertine, and travertine has a stranger origin than almost any stone the Romans built with. It is not a crushed seabed laid down over millions of years. Travertine is made by water, living water, moving water now. In the country around Tivoli, the springs run heavy with dissolved lime carried up from deep underground. And where that water spreads and slows and warms in the open air, it lets the lime fall out of itself and settle, layer on pale layer, into solid rock. The stone is still forming there today. You can stand and watch it grow. The Colosseum is built of a stone that the earth was, in effect, secreting, a mineral crust precipitated out of spring water hardening in the sun. They quarried it in the open in great terraced pits, livering and sawing the blocks free along their natural beds. Travertine cuts more easily when it first comes out of the ground, still damp, and hardens as it dries in the air. So the Romans worked it fresh and let it set into the building, and they needed an ocean of it. To carry 100,000 cubic meters of stone the 20 miles from Tivoli to the building site, the emperor's engineers laid a special road, widened and strengthened for the endless traffic of ox carts, each block weighing many tons, grinding down out of the hills toward the city in a line that must have taken years to pass. There was no river to float it on as there had been in Egypt, just the road and the oxen and the wheel, which the Romans had in abundance. Rome moved its mountains on axles and paved stone, one groaning cart at a time, but travertine was precious, and travertine was heavy, and you could not build a whole mountain of it. Not even Rome was that rich. So the visible stone is only the skeleton. Behind it, between it, underneath it, the Colosseum is filled with something cheaper and in its way far more revolutionary. Concrete. Roman concrete, opus cementitium, the material that built the empire. The Romans had discovered something the world would then forget for more than 1,000 years, that if you take lime and mix it with a particular volcanic ash and add rubble and water, you get an artificial stone that will set hard even underwater and grow stronger with the years. The ash was the secret. They called it pozzolana, after the town of Pozzuoli near Naples, where they first dug it, a gray volcanic dust that, stirred into wet lime, turned a gray slop into rock. Beneath the Colosseum, they poured it by the thousands of tons. The whole building sits on a single vast ring of concrete, some 12 meters deep, sunk into the drained bed of an old lake to carry the unimaginable load above. And up through the structure, the vaults and the sloping floors that held the crowd were cast in concrete faced with brick and light volcanic rock, so that the higher you climbed, the lighter the materials became. Heavy travertine at the base, airy tufa at the top, shedding weight as it rose. And here is the part that has stunned modern engineers. In 2023, a team studying Roman concrete found that it was quietly self-healing. Scattered through the ancient mix are little white lumps of lime that everyone had assumed were simply sloppy work, until it turned out they were the repair kit. When a crack opens and rainwater seeps in, it dissolves those lumps, and the lime recrystallizes inside the crack and seals it shut. The concrete heals its own wounds. 2,000 years on, we are only now learning to copy what the Romans poured into the dark under the arena and forgot. Now, the material that this whole story turns on, the one buried so deep that most people never learn it is there at all: iron. A building like the Colosseum has a terrible enemy, and the enemy is itself. All that weight of stone curved into arches and rings is constantly trying to push outward, to spread, to slide, to shrug its own blocks apart and collapse into a heap. Mortar alone will not hold travertine blocks of many tons against that endless outward shove. So the Romans reached for metal. Through the great travertine blocks at the joints they cut shallow slots, and into those slots they set clamps of iron shaped like a flattened letter I, bridging the gap from one block to the next. Then they poured molten lead around each clamp to seat it fast and seal it against rust. Block locked to block, ring locked to ring, the whole vast ellipse stitched together with a concealed mesh of metal. Scholars have put the total at somewhere around 300 tons of iron threaded invisibly through the stone. A whole skeleton of forged metal mined and smelted and hammered out over charcoal fires across Italy, then hidden forever inside the walls. Think about what that means. Under the marble and the travertine, the most advanced building of the ancient world was a metal-laced structure, stone on the outside, iron on the inside, holding a curving cliff of masonry against the very physics that wanted to pull it down. The arena of death was, secretly, a machine of iron. For 400 years, while the empire that built it still stood, the metal held. And then the empire fell, and men came with picks to tear it out. So who forged such a thing, and why, and how fast? The answer begins with a fire and a tyrant. In the year 64, much of Rome burned, and the Emperor Nero seized a huge tract of the ruined city center and built himself a private pleasure palace across it, the Golden House, with landscaped grounds and an artificial lake, and beside it a bronze statue of himself as the sun god, over 30 meters tall, the Colossus. Rome hated him for it. He had swallowed the heart of the public city into his own garden. Nero fell and killed himself, and after a year of civil war, a hard old general named Vespasian took the throne and founded a new dynasty, the Flavians. And Vespasian made a calculated gift to the people he now ruled. He drained Nero's private lake, and on that very spot, the selfish emperor's boating pond, he began to raise a stone amphitheater for the whole city. Where one man had floated alone, 50,000 would now roar together. It was propaganda written in travertine, and we know, more or less, who paid for it. A worn inscription, its bronze letters long gone, but the peg holes that held them still readable in the stone, records that the amphitheater was raised ex manubas, from the spoils of war. The spoils were Jewish. In the year 70, Vespasian's son Titus had stormed Jerusalem, burned its second temple to the ground, and carried its treasure and tens of thousands of its captives back to Rome. The gold of the temple, and very likely the forced labor of its enslaved survivors, built the Colosseum. One sacred house was torn down to fund the greatest killing house ever raised, and they raised it with astonishing speed. Begun around the year 72, the amphitheater was opened by Titus. In the year 80, perhaps 8 years to build the largest arena in the world. The Romans dedicated it with 100 days of games, in which, the historians tell us, 9,000 animals were slaughtered. Now, at last, the blood, because everything so far was built to make one thing possible. The word itself tells you what the floor was made of. In the middle of the great ellipse lay a wooden platform, and over the timber the Romans spread a deep layer of sand. Arena in Latin means simply sand. The sand was the working surface of the machine, and it was there for a practical, terrible reason. Sand drinks blood. Day after day it soaked up the blood of men and animals and was raked over or dug out and replaced so the killing could go on across a clean, pale floor. We have named every bull ring and every sports arena on earth after that patch of blood-soaked sand, and what happened on it has never quite been matched for organized cruelty. In the morning came the beast hunts. Leopards, lions, bears, elephants, hippos, animals dragged from the furthest edges of the empire to be killed in their thousands for the pleasure of the crowd. At midday, the executions, the condemned thrown to animals or burned or forced to kill one another. And in the afternoon, the gladiators, most of them slaves or prisoners, a few of them volunteers chasing glory, fighting under the eyes of 50,000 people and an emperor whose gesture could spare or end a life. Across the near 4 centuries, the arena worked. The numbers grow numbing. No one can count them exactly, but the dead, human and animal together, must run into the hundreds of thousands. A whole industry grew up to feed the floor. Schools to train the fighters, networks to trap and ship the beasts, a supply chain of death reaching from the forests of Germany to the deserts of Africa, converging on one sanded oval in the middle of Rome. The Colosseum was not a stadium. It was an engine for turning living things into spectacle, and it ran on and off for close to 400 years. And to keep it running took a machinery that most of the crowd never saw, because it lay beneath their feet. Lift up that sanded wooden floor, and you look down into the real marvel of the Colosseum. Not the seats, not the arches, the basement. Beneath the arena lay the hypogeum. The word means simply underground. A 2-story labyrinth of brick and stone passages, cells, and ramps sunk some 6 meters into the earth and running the whole length and breadth of the floor above. It was a backstage the size of the arena itself, and it was crammed with machinery. Here was the muscle of the killing machine, and it was made of timber, rope, and bronze. Set into the walls all around the underground were dozens of vertical shafts, and in each shaft a wooden platform, a lift, a cage elevator, counterweighted and hauled by teams of men working capstans, the great turning drums that wound the ropes. Beasts were loaded into the cages in the darkness below, and on a signal the crews threw their weight against the capstan bars, and the platform rose, and a trapdoor sprang open in the arena floor above, and a lion or a bear or a painted stage set of a forest erupted into the daylight and the roar as if it had come out of nowhere. Archaeologists mapping the grooves and sockets worn into the stone have counted something on the order of 24 or more of these lifts, all worked by hand, all hidden, all synchronized by an unseen crew sweating in the dark. Trapdoors, hoists, hinged ramps, cages sliding on tracks. The hypogeum was a vast wooden engine driven by muscle whose only purpose was to make death appear suddenly and from everywhere at once. The timber has all rotted away now. What you see when you look down into the Colosseum today is the bare brick and stone skeleton of that basement, stripped of its wooden machinery like the ribs of a beached ship. But once this pit was alive with rope and pulley and straining men, the beating heart of the arena, the part of the material machine that did the actual work of terror. And there was one more material system, the most improbable of them all, and it was made of rope and canvas and sky. 50,000 people, packed onto stone seats under the Mediterranean sun, would roast. So the Romans roofed the open bowl of the Colosseum with an awning, the velarium, an enormous retractable canopy of canvas that could be drawn across the sky to throw the crowd into shade. Look at the top of the surviving wall, and you can still read how it worked. Around the very rim of the building runs a ring of stone brackets and sockets, where 240 tall wooden masts once stood, jutting up above the topmost seats. From those masts, a spider's web of ropes ran inward and down over the audience, and along them the great panels of sailcloth could be hauled out across the void and pulled back again. And who could handle rigging on that scale? Not builders, sailors. The awning was worked by a detachment of men from the imperial fleet at Misenum, professional seamen who spent their lives hauling sail on warships brought inland to Rome to fight the wind above the arena. When the crowd looked up from the sand and the blood and saw the canvas billow across the sun, they were watching sailors work a ship's rigging the size of the sky. It was the last layer of the machine, stone to carry it, concrete to fill it, iron to hold it, timber to run it, and canvas at the top to shade it, spread over the whole roaring bowl like a sail over the deck of the largest ship in the world. And for a few centuries, with the empire at its height, the whole impossible contraption worked. Nothing runs forever, and slowly the machine began to stop. As the centuries turned and the empire weakened and became Christian, the appetite for the old slaughter faded. The beast hunts and the executions dragged on into the 6th century, but the gladiators fought their last somewhere in the early 400s. A Christian empire could no longer quite stomach the arena its own capital had been built around. The killing machine fell quiet. The sand went unraked. The lifts stood still in the dark, and the ropes rotted on their drums. And then the earth itself began to take the building apart. Rome sits in a land of earthquakes, and over the centuries the shocks came. In 443, in 484, again and again, each one cracking the great ellipse a little further. The worst came in the year 1349. An enormous quake that threw down the entire outer ring along the southern side, where the ground beneath the foundations was softest. That is why the Colosseum has two faces today. On one side, the famous 4-story wall rising almost to its full height. On the other, a lower, broken inner edge, the stump of where the outer shell crashed down in a single afternoon and lay in a mountain of shattered travertine across the ground. And that fallen stone, and the stone still standing, now became something new. Not a monument, not even a ruin, quite. A resource, a mine, in a city that had once ruled the world and now held only a few thousand souls camped among the wreckage. The greatest amphitheater ever built became the most convenient quarry in Rome. A mountain of ready-cut stone and buried metal, free for the taking to anyone with a cart and a crowbar. For 1,000 years, Rome ate the Colosseum. Popes and princes sent their workmen to the arena as though to a quarry face. The fallen travertine was carted off first, then the standing blocks were prized down and broken up, burned in kilns to make lime, or dressed and reset into the new Rome rising out of the medieval mud. Trace the honey-colored stone across the city, and you find the Colosseum scattered all through it, in the walls and steps of palaces, in bridges, in churches. Some of the very travertine cut from the hills of Tivoli for Vespasian's arena, stands today in the fabric of St. Peter's itself. The killing house of the pagans was quarried to raise the greatest church of the Christians. And here we come back to the holes, because the scavengers did not only want the stone, they wanted the iron. Somewhere in those hungry centuries, men worked their way across every reachable surface of the building, found the joints where the clamps were hidden, and dug the metal out. Hundreds of tons of ancient iron hacked from the stone and carried off to be forged into tools and weapons and sold. They gutted the building's nervous system for scrap, and each clamp they tore loose left behind the slot it had sat in, a squarish pit gouged into the block. Those are the holes, the thousands of pockmarks that scar the Colosseum today, that every visitor takes for the wear of ages, are man-made wounds. The empty sockets where the iron skeleton used to be. The building is pitted all over with the marks of its own robbery. When you photograph the Colosseum, you are photographing the negative space of 300 tons of vanished metal, the shape of everything that was pulled out of it. Everything softer and everything more useful was carried away. What remained was only what no one could easily move or burn or melt: the bones. The Colosseum was built to be a machine for death, and it worked for a while exactly as it was meant to. Then the men who ran it died, and the crowd that filled it died, and the emperors who paid for it died, and the empire that dreamed it up died with them. The sand that drank the blood was scattered to the wind. The wooden floor rotted through. The lifts and capstans and trap doors collapsed into the dark and turned to dust. The great awning burned or rotted away centuries ago. The masts are gone. The sailors from Misenum are 2,000 years dead. Even the iron, the hidden skeleton, the 300 tons of metal that was meant to hold the whole thing together forever, even the iron was torn out and melted down and scattered across the tools and blades of another age. Almost everything that made the Colosseum a machine is gone. What is left is the least of it and the slowest: the stone, the travertine that grew drop by drop out of the springs at Tivoli and was dragged down to Rome and stacked into arches and pinned with iron and packed with concrete and floored with blood-soaked sand. The stone outlasted all of it. It outlasted the killing that was built to stage. It outlasted the men who tore it apart for scrap, and it is still standing, pocked and broken and half-quarried, on the spot where Nero's lake once lay. Go back one last time to the holes in the wall. Each one is an absence, the ghost of a piece of iron forged by a Roman hand that held two stones together for 400 years and was then ripped away. The metal is gone. The stone kept the shape of where it was. That is the last truth of the Colosseum, and it is the truth of every great thing that men build to outlast themselves. The blood dries, the iron rusts, and is stolen. The machine stops, and in the end there is only the material standing in the sun, holding the memory of everything that has been taken out of it. The arena is silent. The stone remembers.